Welcome to Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, at the Lebanese International University, LIU, in Nabatea in South Lebanon. Those pictures were very painful for my audience this evening, both here and abroad, because on the hill behind me, there used to be an occupation force that used to treat prisoners from here just like that. But this is going on this very day. More than 100 prisoners are being held behind the barbed wire of Guantanamo Bay. Guantanamo Bay is not the only excrescence in the so-called war on terror, of course. There are other Guantanamo Bays at Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan, in Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq, in other secret prisons, so-called black prisons, not marked on any map, for which there are no road signs and certainly no rules and regulations. We're focusing on Guantanamo Bay, largely because more than 100 of the prisoners in that excrescence called Guantanamo Bay, or Gitmo, as the United States habitually refers to it as, in occupied territory in Cuba, I may add, are on hunger strike and are being force-fed in the most horrific manner. Every night when the iftar is being taken across the Ummah, these men are being force-fed through their nose against their will in one of the most obscene forms of torture yet developed in the so-called war on terror. One of the founding fathers of the American Constitution, Benjamin Franklin, opined centuries ago that any society which will sacrifice liberty for security will in the end enjoy neither liberty nor security. And this is exactly what has happened in the United States over this last decade and more, since 9/11, 2001. In order to deal with a threat to their security, they have sacrificed their own liberty, encouraged other countries to shred their liberties, in some cases, like our own country in Great Britain, far older liberties of 1,000 years and more, in order to provide security. But of course, security never comes. You lose both the liberty and the security. And it's one of the great paradoxes of this age that the countries who talk most about human rights, about the rule of law, about liberty, are the countries who with the greatest alacrity and totality are ready to tear up all of these things when it comes to the confrontation that they are now locked into with large sections of the Muslim world. Moreover, it seems not yet to have occurred to the United States and its allies that it is previous abuses of liberty and human rights and dignity that have led to that confrontation in the first place. It seems not to have yet dawned on policymakers in Washington, where we'll be going later in this show to talk to some of the people involved in these issues. It doesn't seem to have dawned on them that it is their double standards when it comes to other people's blood, when it comes to other people's suffering, that has led them to this point in this great global confrontation. More than half of the prisoners behind the wire in Guantanamo Bay are Yemenis. Most of the prisoners in Guantanamo Bay have been told that they are free to go, but no one will take them, at least no one to whom they will send them. These are men who have faced no charge, no trial, who have been found guilty of absolutely nothing at all, but who have been held, in many cases now, for far more than a decade, in the inhuman, brutal conditions, in the searing heat of the Caribbean, behind the barbed wire, in Cuba, in Guantanamo Bay. They are people who were kidnapped, who were snatched from the streets, in some cases thousands of miles away from any battlefield, in defiance of the national law of the countries from which they were snatched, were carried secretly on flights which never existed, many of them drugged, manacled, shackled, in chains, just like the slaves once were when they crossed the Atlantic, and woke up behind the barbed wire in Guantanamo Bay. It is a legal monstrosity, as even President Obama said when he was running for office. He pledged that he would close Guantanamo Bay in 1 year. We are now halfway through the first year of his second term, and not only is Guantanamo Bay not closed, they are investing hundreds of millions of dollars into expanding it for the prisoners already there and for the prisoners yet to come. It is just one, though a big one, of the marks of shame of the presidency of Barack Hussein Obama, who told us that under him everything would be different. Instead, everything remains the same, except, as in the case of the drone attacks, where it has gotten even worse. We'll be talking tonight to people here in Nabatea who remember prisons like Guantanamo Bay. We'll be talking to people in Yemen, in London, to the people involved in the worldwide campaign to erase this shame from the earth. Welcome to Kalima Horra on Mayadeen television. Now, who from amongst the audience is going to make the first contribution? Doctor, please.
النبطية اللي قبل شوي ذكرت أنه قاعدة على سفح احتلال كانت محاطة بالعدو الإسرائيلي، ويبدو أنه فينا نقول أنه النبطية كانت من أولى المدن يلي شهدت فينا نقول ثورات مدنية بتعبر عن الحرية ضد الاحتلال الإسرائيلي، وسقط شهداء كتير بشوارع النبطية مثل بقية المدن والقرى بجنوب لبنان يلي الحرية كانت بتعني لهم كتير، وبعدها لحد هلا بتعني كتير كتير. أنا كأكاديمي بقدر إني أفهم الخوف من الإرهاب، بقدر إني أفهم الخوف على الأمن القومي، بقدر إني أفهم الخوف على اقتصاد دولة معينة كانت كبيرة أو صغيرة، ولكن ما بقدر أفهم إنه يصير في نوع من الهجيموني، يعني سيطرة الدول الكبرى على الدول الصغيرة، سيطرة العقول المستكبرة على العقول يلي تسعى إلى التحرر ولو ما كان في عندها كل الطاقات يلي ممكن إنه تساعدها بهذا التحرر. نحن اللي بدنا نحاول نقوله الحمد لله نحن كانت عندنا تجربة كتير ناصعة، أخذت شوية وقت ولكن أثبتت أنه الحرية منا شيء ممكن أنه واحد يتساهل فيه أو أنه يساوم عليه. حريتنا يعني شيء مقدس. اللي عم ينعمل بغوانتنامو باي يعني بكل الأعراف منه مقبول. هذا الشيء اللي وصلنا حقيقة، اللي وصلنا عبر الإعلام ما ممكن انه ينقبل. فكيف يلي مش عم يوصلنا، كيف يلي هو behind closed doors، اللي عم نشوفه نحن يمكن من الكاميرات البعيدة المدى، أو اللي عم ينقلوا لنا إياه بعض السجناء اللي عم يتحرروا، أو بعض السجانين يلي عم بيصير في عندهم يمكن طفرة ضمير ويقولوا شو عم بيصير، هذا شيء مش مقبول ابدا ابدا ابدا. وبالتالي لازم يكون في وعي كافي عند الشعوب اللي موجوده عندنا بمناطقنا، وعند يعني يا ريت توصل هذه الرساله كمان لشعوب الدول يلي عم ترعى هذا النوع من الارهاب. انا بسمي هذا هو الارهاب الحقيقي، مش الارهاب هن اللي عملوه هود العالم، بغض النظر شو عملوا. يمكن يكون معهم حق باعتقالهم، يمكن ما يكون معهم حق، بس الطريقه اللي عم يعاملوا فيها هي ارهاب حقيقي بكل ما للكلمه من معنى. انا
Thank you, Dr. Hassan, and thank you for your gracious hospitality here at the LIU in Nabatea in South Lebanon. I'll be back right after this. You're watching Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Mayadeen television here at the LIU in Nabatea in South Lebanon, talking about Guantanamo Bay. I have the privilege now to know personally several people who were incarcerated for years in Guantanamo Bay without charge, without trial, who were tortured there and who still suffer the nightmares of their time behind the wire. And this evening, as last evening and the next evening, many of these prisoners, more than 100 according to the inmates, will be force-fed their iftar at the end of the day's fasting. It is a brutal, monstrous regime which is being practiced by the country which talks most about the need for human rights, liberty, and the rule of law. Indeed, they invade and occupy countries in the name of those things, whilst in a piece of territory which is occupied illegally by them in Cuba. And we're talking about whether it has made America safer, what it tells us about the depth of the United States' commitment to the liberty that they profess and that they invade and occupy other people's countries in order to impose. My audience here knows all about this kind of thing, because very near to here, indeed just a few 100 meters from here on the mountain behind me, prisons like that and treatment like that used to be routinely meted out to the people of South Lebanon by the occupier that they call Israel. The people of Lebanon drove out their tormentor, their persecutor, their torturer, the people at Guantanamo and the other Guantanamos, and let's not forget them, are not able to do that. So they require the rest of us to remember them, to pray for them, to campaign for their release. I'll be talking shortly to Mohammed Alao, a lawyer in Yemen, who's campaigning for the Yemeni prisoners. More than, half of the prisoners now being held in Guantanamo Bay are from Yemen. But whilst I try to get through to him, let's take some more contributions from the studio audience here. Yes, madam.
Fawzia Tarhini, School of Education. I was reading the other day about force feeding in Guantanamo. And I have read actually about the call that they are actually calling for waterboarding.
Calling for?
Waterboarding. They believe that this is an act of humanity. They believe that they are doing so in order to save those people from ending their own lives. However, this is one perspective of the story. There is another perspective, which is the power and identity those people are trying to convey to the entire world. I'm talking about the power of identity because once we convey it to the entire world, we try to get people to believe in things that they thought they don't make sense. They might think, and why are we doing so? Why are we starving ourselves to death? The point is, we're not starving ourselves to death. We are trying to convey a message that we have the right to justice. They believed they have this human rights initiative. The United States has actually the highest level of incarceration. They believe that they call for human rights and they are fighting terrorism after 9/11. However, their own people believe that they faced terrorism before 9/11. It wasn't actually the very first time that they were facing terrorism. They faced apartheid injustice at that time. We always call for technology. We are bedazzled by the advancements and development in the world. However, those cannot be conveyed, cannot be concentrated on unless they are married with justice, with not only justice but a humanity. I believe that in order for us to come to the human sense of life, my humanity depends on your humanity. My survival depends on your survival. No matter how much we are committed to the scientific thought, it's not only the matter of the mind. We are creative, but our creativity does not come from our minds only. It comes from the conviction in our hearts.
Yeah.
And these two have to be the very same thing.
Well, look, we don't have to take your word for it or my word for it. We can take the word of President Obama himself. When he was running for office, he condemned this legal black hole as one of the biggest shames that America had ever indulged in. He's the one who told us that it was completely unacceptable to hold men forever, potentially, without even being charged, without being tried, without being convicted. He told us this. But now, almost 5 years later, we are still having to look at pictures of the people being treated in this way behind the wire. And you make an important point, that these men are not trying to starve themselves to death. They're trying to tell the world that the living hell that President Obama is presiding over is so hellish that they are ready to risk death by starvation. I have to cut you short because I have on the line Muhammad Allow, the Yemeni campaigner for the Yemeni prisoners, the biggest number of prisoners in Guantanamo Bay, and a lawyer as well. Muhammad, can you hear me? Good evening to you from South Lebanon. Tell us about the plight of the Yemeni prisoners in Guantanamo Bay and what's going to happen to them.
ما يحل بهم هذا في علم أرحم الراحمين والحزب الديمقراطي وأوباما. للأسف الشديد صار مصير معتقل غوانتنامو في حكم المجهول نتيجة التجربة السياسية داخل الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية وفزاعة الإرهاب الذي صاروا يبتزوا به العالم وتنتهك أمريكا كل مبادئ حقوق الإنسان. وما بعد حقوق الإنسان فقد صار اليمنيين في غوانتنامو ليس فقط أن ليس لهم حقوق البشر بس حتى حقوق الحيوانات. فقد أخرجوهم من دائرة البشرية إلى أنهم صاروا أرقاما يتعاملوا معهم ليس لهم أي حقوق يعني تعارفت عليها البشرية. طبعا هناك أقوال عديدة. مرة يعد أوباما كما هو معروف في حملته الأولى بأنه سيغلق هذا المعسكر ثم يتصدى له الجمهوريين، ولأن الديمقراطيين ضعاف في الغالب في القرارات الخارجية فكان المؤمل أن يتم إنفاذ ما كان قد تم الاتفاق عليه في عهد إدارة بوش بأن يتم نقل اليمنيين لمدة سنة للتأهيل في السعودية ثم يسلمون اليمن. للأسف الشديد عندما أتى أوباما وكان قد وعد بإغلاق المعسكر بعد ذلك هذه الوعود تلاشت والسعودية تنصلت ودخل الجمهوريين مع الديمقراطيين في جدال على حساب حرية اليمنيين. وآخر هذا الجدال أن أوباما كان وعد مؤخرا بأنه سيسلمهم لليمن بعد زيارة الرئيس منصور هادي، لكننا فوجئنا قبل أسابيع بقانون يصدره مجلس النواب يمنع تسليم اليمنيين إلى بلدهم، والكلام يدور الآن حول تسليمهم لبلد ثالث. ما هي الحكمة؟ وخاصة وأن اليمنيين وفقا لمراجعة الأمنية 58 منهم كان يفترض أن يخرج عنهم منذ زمن، وآخرين بأحكام قضائية، فحقيقة هذه النقطة السوداء في وجه الحكومة الأمريكية بل والشعب الأمريكي، رغم تعاطف الكثير من المحامين ومنظمات حقوق الإنسان من الشعب الأمريكي، لكن في آخر الأمر سياسة هذه الدولة القمعية الاستعلائية يعني يدفع ثمنها اليمنيون في غوانتنامو وغيرهم، وهم كنا طبعا اليوم الرقم الأول، لأن الأرقام الموجودة يعني في حدود 160 منهم 94 من اليمن، يعني في حدود أكثر من النصف. فيعني القضية الشائكة الصلف الأمريكي اللي استعلى ضرب يعني بعرض الحائط كل مبادئ حقوق الإنسان من قبل الإدارة الأمريكية، لأنها تغولت فلم يعد هناك من يحاسبها أو يملك القول لها. لا.
Tell me, what's the stated reason for refusing to release them to Yemen but to send them to Saudi Arabia instead?
قيل بأن هناك مخاوف من أنهم سينضمون إلى القاعدة إذا ما تم الإفراج عنهم. فقلنا لهم المساجين من أفغانستان وفيها حرب دائرة من قبل طالبان كانوا هم الرقم الثاني بعد السعوديين، وكان اليمنيين في بداية المعتقل هم الرقم الثالث. هؤلاء عادوا ولم يبقى إلا عدد بسيط جدا منهم، وأفغانستان منطقة أكثر خطورة من اليمن. لماذا اليمنيين فقط؟ فحقيقة مبرراتهم واهية ولا تملك أي منطق، وفقط استعلاء وصلف أمريكي لا أقل ولا أكثر.
Is this a big issue in Yemen?
بالتأكيد يتم الحديث عنها كثيرا، لكن طبعا تعرف بأن كل حكوماتنا العربية والعالم اليوم ليس إلا ذيلا للسياسة الأمريكية، وخاصة بأننا قد تناحرنا في بعضنا فصرنا رهينة للابتزاز الغربي والأمريكي، وبالتالي حكوماتنا السابقة واللاحقة ليست إلا شرطة للولايات المتحدة الأمريكية في تقتل أبنائها بالطائرات بدون طيار ويسجن أبنائها ولا تملك حولا ولا قوة. فطبعا اعتمادا على الضعف العربي العام واليمني الخاص وحاجة الناس في اليمن لرعاية إنجاز المبادرة الخليجية وخروج الناس من هذه الكارثة أو الأزمة أو ما نسميه في اليمن، هذا كله يجعل الإدارة الأمريكية يعني هي صاحبة اليد العليا علينا، ولذلك من رئيس الدولة وحتى أصغر موظف في هذه البلد ليسوا إلا عساكر من البؤس بمكان لدى السياسة الأمريكية لا يملكون لها ردا ولا رفضا لمشيئتها التي تريد.
And what about the suicides, so-called? Most of the deaths in Guantanamo Bay have been Yemenis, claimed as suicides. What were they really, in your opinion, Mohammed?
والله احنا القضايا التي وصلتنا وتم التحقيق فيها والتقارير من الأساتذة التشريح الأطباء الأوروبيين في السويسريين الذين حضروا إلى اليمن واستعرضوا الجثث التي وصلت السلمي والآخر، وقالوا بأن الشبهة الجنائية قائمة وليس انتحارا، لأن الجثث عادت وقد أخذت منها أجزاء كانت ستبين المسألة، فإخفاءها يشير بأن الأمر كان قتلا وليس انتحارا.
Mohammed, thank you very much indeed for joining us and shedding some light on a very dark corner indeed of Guantanamo Bay. Thank you for your participation. Let me go back to the audience, but it'll be after the break. Welcome back to Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Mayadeen television. Now, most of those watching this program will be fasting, and they will break their fast with great solemnity and joy. But in Guantanamo, it's quite different. Take a look at this if you've got a strong stomach. twice a day, taking up to 2 hours to complete. That's the reality of force feeding in Guantanamo Bay this Ramadan. Please don't forget it. Now let's go back to the audience here at the LIU in Nabatea. I think a young man there in the second row. What do you think about this situation?
My name is Mustafa Annan, biology pre-med I study. And my question for tonight, well, first of all, I want to welcome you here in Nabatea, South Lebanon. My question will start with, okay, well, you said we're praying for these people, we're campaigning for them. I just want to ask you about, like, what do you think each of us, like right here, standing here, each member in South Lebanon, each member in Lebanon, each member in the Arab community is held responsible for? Like, what is the responsibility that we hold towards the Guantanamo Bay detainees? My question is, what do you think is the solution, and how can we contribute to that? Looking by the fact that the United States has reopened the Guantanamo Bay since 2001, and it's continuing now in 2013. It's been 12 years now. What do you think is the solution? And the United States will keep going, I mean, because they claim they want to protect their land from the terrorists, and obviously half or more than half of these people are free and have no charges and go without trials. So what is the solution here, and how can we contribute to that?
Well, logically, the first priority of people in every country should be to free the compatriots that they have inside the wire. In England, and we'll be talking later to one of the campaigners, we have one person, Shakar Amar, the last British prisoner in Guantanamo Bay. We have had several, most of whom we've been able to free over recent years, although they're not free from the nightmares, of course, of what happened to them there. All completely innocent people, innocent of any crime, never charged, never tried, never convicted. And Lebanon has one prisoner behind the wire. I don't know what campaign exists in Lebanon, and I know you have many other priorities. I know you have George Abdullah in France, for example, and you have many other problems just a few kilometers from here. But it should be an article of faith of the Lebanese public to free the Lebanese national who is behind the wire. And the reason the United States doesn't pay any attention to those countries who have people behind the wire is because those countries' governments are not trying hard enough. If they were making more of an issue with the United States, if they were forcing up the price of the United States continuing to hold these people unjustly, unfairly, in defiance of all international law and national law, then the United States would have to think harder about finding a solution. But you ask me what the solution is, it's simple. If these men have committed an offense, then charge them and try them under the appropriate judicial code. If they have not and you cannot, then set them free. That's the demand that we have to make. That's the demand the United States would make of any other country holding a prisoner that they themselves wanted to see freed. But thanks for that contribution. Let's take the young woman at the front here.
Good evening. My name is Shah Sabra. I would like to ask you a question tonight. Since we're talking about this specific topic, you already mentioned the way that we can free our prisoners there. But what is the real reason for this country that is speaking, as you mentioned before, of human rights to keep those men without even giving them justice, the right trial or something like that? What is the real reason behind this that would make us try so hard to get them back to their countries or families?
Well, you might be the youngest person here, but you've asked the best question. The best question is, how can it be that we continue to accept the United States self-image of itself as the leader of the so-called free world? They still talk about themselves in this way. President Obama and other American leaders go around the world lecturing people, threatening people for abuses of human rights, lack of democracy, lack of liberty, while they themselves are presiding over one of the greatest blots, shames, marks of shame anywhere in the world today. So I personally laugh. I went once to the United States Senate, famously in 2005, and if I say so myself, I gave them a good beating, because I didn't allow them to portray this self-image. I told them the truth of what we all think about them and what we all think about the way they behave. But that's not what happens with governments. The Secretary of State of the United States comes here and people kiss her. People kiss them. People kiss their hand. People treat them as if they're the rulers of the world and the paragons of virtue which they portray themselves in. We should laugh at this idea. And we should say to them, don't talk to me about human rights whilst you have these prisoners in Guantanamo Bay. Don't talk to me about human rights or democracy or liberty whilst you are crushing human rights, democracy and liberty all over the world. That's the proper approach to the United States government. Instead of lining up to kiss their cheeks, we should be lining up to metaphorically slap their face and show the world what they really are. Now I'm hoping to talk to another guest shortly internationally, but not yet it seems. So let's take another contribution. Yes, Doctor, please.
Dr. Jawad Shaheen, Acting Assistant Dean School of Business. السؤال أنه العرب معروفين دائما بأنه يحبون تقليد الولايات المتحدة. يعني كل شيء موجود بالولايات المتحدة أو بالغرب بيستوردوا العرب، إن كان من أفكار، إن كان من بضائع، إن كان من أي شيء. هل تعتبر أنه غوانتنامو أو ما يجري في غوانتنامو هو صناعة أمريكية، أو أنه أمريكا قلدت سجون العرب وأخذت الممارسات إلى غوانتنامو هناك؟ وكم من مئات غوانتنامو موجودين عندنا من المحيط إلى الخليج إلى إسرائيل لا يسلط الضوء عليهم؟ وتساؤل بعد أنه شو مصلحة أمريكا بإبقاء غوانتنامو طالما هي قادرة أنه تعتقل هول الأشخاص بسجون بالمناطق اللي هي بتسيطر عليها، ممكن يلاقوا فيها كمان ممارسات أفظع مما يجري بغوانتنامو. يعني بغوانتنامو اليوم الإعلام مسلط على غوانتنامو، بينما كان فينا نحطهم أو الأمريكيين يحطوا هالمساجين أو المعتقلين أو الأسرى إذا بدنا في معتقلات بالدول العربية أو بأفغانستان أو بأي مكان آخر بالعالم دون أن يتم تسليط الضوء عليهم. فشو مصلحة أمريكا بأنه تكون هي بالواجهة وأنه أمريكا تعتقل هول الأشخاص وتعذبهم وتمارس بحقهم هالانتهاكات بحقوق الإنسان؟ شكرا.
Well, with apologies to the young woman, that's now the best question. Because, of course, when we talk about Guantanamo Bay, we can only do so because we know it exists. We know it's there. It's on the map. There are cameras outside it, trained upon it. But as I said right at the beginning, there are many Guantanamos, the existence of which we don't know. And most of those are in Arab countries. We don't have to name them on this program. Most of the people watching will know where they are or where they're likely to be. And if this is what's going on in Guantanamo, imagine what's going on in these Arab Guantanamos. And it just goes to show the thinness of the veneer of democracy and civilization that this great power of the United States covers its crimes in. If you scratch that veneer, it will tear, and behind it you will see the same, because torture is torture. If anyone has seen the movie with Jack Nicholson for which he won an Oscar, which is called A Few Good Men, or anyone who's seen Syriana, you know what torture is. It's the dirtiest, most foul, in my opinion, it's even more foul than murder, because you are systematically keeping someone alive in order to inflict horrific pain upon them, to obtain something from them, which in almost all cases is not worth having, because people will say anything under torture. But the underlying point you make is also a terrific one, and it's the one I tried to encapsulate in the formulation of Benjamin Franklin. If you do this, you are not going to obtain security. but you are definitely going to lose liberty. Because in the United States and elsewhere in my own country, I mean, these secret flights on the way to secret Guantanamos have landed in airports in Britain. The British authorities, though they said in front of Parliament under oath that they knew nothing about these flights, increasingly, because nothing remains a secret in this world anymore, it's becoming obvious that they did know that this secret flight had a prisoner on board who was probably drugged, probably chained, and was probably on his way to another horrific Guantanamo. Let's squeeze one more speaker in. Yes, sir, please.
حسام فحص School of Art and Science التلايو. بالطبع حكومة الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية بيفسروا هن الإرهاب على مصالحهم الشخصية، ولكن هن ما بيعرفوا تماما إنه بنفس الوقت عم بيحجزوا هن حرية الأشخاص، والحرية عند الأشخاص حرية مقدسة. هؤلاء الأشخاص نفسهم لما بتنحجز حريتهم وبس إذا طلعوا أو حتى أهاليهم أو مجتمعهم مرة تانية حرجعوا يقوموا على الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية كمان بعمليات، لأنه هول بدهم يرجعوا يسترجعوا حريتهم ويسترجعوا كرامتهم للأمريكان أصلا بالأساس إن يحتلوا دولهم بعنوان الإرهاب. وكذلك الأمر حيرجعوا للأمريكان بنفس الوقت رجع يسموا هذا الإرهاب، يعني حتضل هالدوامة ماشية عند الأمريكان، والأمريكان عم بيستفيدوا من ما يسمى بالإرهاب مشان يضلوا متحكمين باقتصاد العالم ببعض الدول.
Let's abandon the idea of touching the hearts of these people. Let's abandon the idea of teaching them some morals. Let's teach them instead some practical realities. It is these kind of things which is fanaticizing, extremizing, driving crazy with anger millions of Muslims around the world. Therefore, you will end up less secure than you were before you started. By propping up dictatorships, by invading and occupying Muslim countries, by force-feeding prisoners on hunger strike in the black hole that they call Guantanamo Bay, you are making more dangers for yourself. You are making what was a small... Look, there is a terrorist problem. There are takfiri fanatic extremists in the Muslim world, but they were small in number. Now they are large in number. And to cap it all, in Syria, just across the hills, we are giving guns and money to the very same kind of people. The kind of people they say they have in Guantanamo Bay. If they agreed to go and fight in Syria, the Americans would give them guns and money. So first you drive the Muslims crazy by your double standards and your injustice on Palestine, on Iraq, on all these other issues. Then you make them more crazy by torturing them and illegally rendering them to nameless prisons and disappearing them forever. And then you find another group just like them and you send them to Syria to fight as so-called revolutionaries. I'm not a psychologist or a psychiatrist, but that policy sounds pretty close to insanity to me as a simple parliamentarian. I'll be back right after this. Welcome back to Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Mayadeen television. We're at the LIU in Nabatea in South Lebanon talking about Guantanamo Bay, the real Guantanamo Bay and the mini Guantanamo Bays around the world, in which are incarcerated an innumerable number of prisoners who've never been charged with any crime, never been convicted, yet have been held for an indeterminate time, and many of them may stay there for the rest of their lives. Many of them did stay there for the rest of their lives, for they have now perished. We were talking earlier about the national breakdown. I told you that the biggest number was from Yemen. We talked to a Yemeni campaigner. I told you there's one Lebanese national in Guantanamo Bay. There's one British person there also. His name is Shakar Amar. I've played a small part in the campaign. My next speaker has played a big part. She is the chair of the Save Shakar Amar campaign, which has moved mountains in Britain, which gathered 117,000 signatures on a petition forcing a debate in the British Parliament, and has got the British government on the run. Unclear as to whether they really are pushing for Shakar's return to the United Kingdom, or, like the Yemenis, a banishment to Saudi Arabia. Imagine, out of Guantanamo Bay into Saudi Arabia, out of the frying pan into the fire. She's Joy Hercombe. She's the chair of the campaign. She joins me on the line now from England. Joy, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you so much.
Tell us about Shakar Amar and what's happened to him, and what the British government is saying to you about what they're doing to get him out.
Well, Shakar Amar was a charity worker in Afghanistan. He just moved there with his family for a couple of months before 9/11. And when the US and the UK started to bomb Kabul and bombed the school that he was actually started with, Mozambique, they went into hiding, and he sent his family ahead. And subsequently, he was sold twice to warlords, and then eventually was sold to the Americans.
So the Americans actually bought him?
Oh, yes.
Do you happen to know what price they paid for him?
Well, we're told it was $5,000 US.
$5,000 US for a man's life.
And to a villager, that is a lot of money. And of course, they didn't know that these people who were sheltering amongst them would be then transferred to prison for an indeterminate time. So they weren't at fault. They only wished that they could get some money for their family. So Shakar was then sent to Bagram and to Kandahar, where he was badly tortured. And then when he heard American voices, he thought, at last I will be rescued. But of course that was not to be. And from Bagram,
so he heard people speaking English and thought he'd be safe then.
Absolutely. And Shakar is a very fluent speaker, and of course they thought that he would be able to had a high position and must belong to the the Tora Bora or whatever. And of course that was not the case. But they were all lifted. None of them were. They had no crime. They were just lifted for information because they wanted to know if they could get hold of Al-Qaeda or Bin Laden. And of course, Shakar hadn't never seen or heard of Bin Laden. He was just a charity worker doing good in Afghanistan with his family.
Now, what are the British government doing to get a man whose family are British and who are living in London? What are the British government doing to have him released?
Well, we don't think they're doing enough. If they're doing anything at all, they've achieved nothing. So words do not speak as loud as actions. We want action, and it's 11 years now, and Shakar is still in Guantanamo. And although he's been cleared for release on 2 occasions, so we don't understand why it is he's still in Guantanamo. If in their terms, he represents no threat to them, and he should be back with his family, with his British family, with his 4 children and his wife in the UK. And Obama, of course, as you know, has said that he wants to close Guantanamo. It's a stain on their reputation and all that. So why is Shakar Amar still in Guantanamo? And why are those 166 detainees still in Guantanamo without hope of release?
And why is there in the air the possibility that a man whose wife and children are British, who was himself a British resident, might be sent from the frying pan into the fire, from Guantanamo to Saudi Arabia.
It is absolutely shocking and shameful that the British government are not saying to America, no way, this man has been given indefinite leave to remain. He has a British wife and family, and it's a denial of not only his human rights, but the family's human rights to have a family life with their father, with their husband. The British government are at fault for not standing up to the Americans and demanding Shaka's release. They keep saying it's up to the Americans, but we know that behind the scenes, the British government have done not enough. They are also afraid that Shaka will tell the story he has to tell of his torture in the presence of UK agents in Kandahar and in Bagram.
That's
and they want to hush that up. But we know it. We know what happened.
Well, of course they know. They were there. I'm sure that that is the reason. They don't want him back in Britain talking about the torture he has suffered and exactly who was doing the torturing and on whose behalf. Joy, more power to your elbow. A joy to talk to you here in South Lebanon, back there in England. Thank you very much indeed for that contribution. Now, Joy said the British government are to blame for not standing up to the Americans. And the British government, of course, does a lot of service for the United States, and even they have been unable to free a British resident whose wife and children are British citizens and who himself has the legal right to be in the United Kingdom. So you see, this is a worldwide issue, and you've heard from campaigners all over the world. Later we'll talk to one in the United States itself, and everyone watching this has to ask themselves if they themselves are doing enough to free the men behind the wire. Now, there is one member of this audience who is experiencing torture right now. We have placed a device in the ear of one member of this audience. He's already being tortured, though he volunteered for it. His name is Rawad, and for the rest of this show, he will be hearing the high-pitched, so-called white noise, which is one of the torture techniques being practiced in Guantanamo Bay. And we'll see how that experiment goes in the next section of the program. You're watching Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Mayadeen television here at the LIU in Nabatea in South Lebanon. I told you in the last section that one of our audience is currently getting a taste of what the people in Guantanamo Bay suffer for many, many hours at a time, namely the delivery of white noise, a high-pitched noise in their ears which they cannot escape from and which literally drives them mad. Rawad is suffering that. I'm going to let him suffer a little longer so that he can better tell us of the experience, if he will forgive me for that. I want to take another contributor from our audience here. Yes, sir.
من يومين فقط رأينا ببريطانيا أنه زميل لك بالبرلمان ديفيد وارد اسمه تم توقيفه وتوبيخه بس بسبب وصفه إسرائيل بالعنصرية. شو رأيك؟
No, he wasn't arrested. He was suspended from his party. I was expelled from my party long ago. So I formed my own party. And alhamdulillah, we won election after election. So one has to stand up for what is right, not what is popular or what is safe. If I had stood up for what was popular and safe, you would never have heard of me. And nobody would be watching Kalima Horra here tonight. You've heard of me, and they're watching tonight because I have tried to stand up for what is right. Now, let me go to Dr. Nabil Khouri, who is a very significant authority on these matters. He's a clinical psychologist. and he knows about the kind of effect that these kind of tortures have on people. Dr. Nabil, thank you for joining us.
اهلا وسهلا بكم، ولكن الاتصال يتقطع كثيرا وانا اعجز عن سماع كل السؤال بطريقه متواصله.
No, I was merely welcoming you to the show, but I'd like you now, if you would, to describe the kind of state of mind these prisoners must now be in after all these years incarcerated without limit of time in Guantanamo Bay.
كل سجين يخضع لضغوطات تخرج على المألوف اليومي لحياته اليومية كسجين، يتعرض للتعذيب، يتعرض للإساءة إلى كرامته، يتعرض للإساءة إلى كلمته الذاتية وشخصيته، يعاني من النتائج والتداعيات لهذه المعاملة لسنوات كثيرة تنعكس سلبا على أدائه الإنساني والاجتماعي والعلائقي والتواصل مع كافة أطياف المجتمع. التعذيب يخلق آثارا كبيرة في نفسية الإنسان يوصله إلى أمراض نفسية متعددة لا مجال لتسلسلها الآن، ولكن الواقع أن التعذيب أنواع، وقد يكون التعذيب بالموسيقى وشاهدناه في بوسائل تعذيبية تعلمناها على الأقل بوسائط علم النفس عندما درسنا كيفية الإساءة إلى النفس البشرية لتطعيمها، لتطبيعها، لقولبتها بأسلوب يبعد كل البعد عن شرائط حقوق الإنسان وعن الضرورات التي تتحكم بتواصلنا البشري الذي تسيء إلى بشريتنا وإلى بشرية المعتقل في أمام.
We have in the audience this evening Rawad, who's currently being tortured by white noise. In both ears, he can't escape from it. High velocity, high-pitched noise. This, I understand, is regular as a means of torture in Guantanamo Bay. What would be the effects on Rawad if we kept this going hour after hour after hour?
النظام العصبي يحتمل الضجيج الأبيض أو الوايت نويز لفترة زمنية حسب كفاءة الإنسان وطاقته التجابهية وإمكانياته الإدراكية وتدريبه على كيفية مواجهة وسائل التعذيب. ولكن الإنسان العادي، الإنسان الذي لم يتعرض لوسائل تمكنه من مجابهة التعذيب بطرقه الدفاعية الذاتية يصل إلى حد الانهيار الكامل، لأن النظام العصبي ينحدر مستوى دفاعاته إلى أقصى درك، وبالتالي يعجز الإنسان لا عن ممارسة دوره الإدراكي بطريقة سليمة، أي تنقص طاقاته التجابهية وحتى طاقات ذكائه، يضعف أمام كل عمليات التواصل المجتمعي فيصبح فاشلا في لقاءاته الاجتماعية والإنسانية، وحتى يصل إلى درجة من عدم الإنتاجية، لأن سلوكياته تصبح محكومة بالضغوطات العصبية التي تعرض لها، وبالتالي لا يمكنه أن ينتج لا فكريا ولا معنويا ولا مهنيا، ونكون قد حطمنا فيه كل إمكانياته التواصلية وأزلنا كل طاقاته الإدراكية، أي أسأنا إلى إمكانياته الأكاديمية أيضا، وألغينا عنه إمكانية المجابهة، صنعنا منه بعبارة أوضح إنسانا فاشلا.
And what are the possibilities to recover from this kind of thing? The sophistication of it beggars belief. We're not talking about the old-fashioned torture of hanging people up from walls, though they do that, of pulling people's fingernails, though they have done that. We're talking about the use of high technology and the measurement of the impact with the faces, for example, the happy to sad faces by which they measure these things. Can prisoners recover from this kind of thing? Is there treatment available that can help them recuperate?
إن التجارب التي عشناها مع المعذبين في السجون وتحديدا الذين أتوا من الدول العربية والذين تم تعذيبهم تحديدا في العراق، نحن نقوم بثلاث أمور في الواقع. الأمر الأول هو تشخيص المشكلة النفسية التي نشأت من التعذيب. بعد التشخيص نحدد ما إذا كان هناك إمكانية لشفائه عن طريق البروجنوسيس، أي إمكانيات الشفاء، يعني ما هي العلاجات التي يمكن أن نستعملها. هناك نتائج حتى الآن ليست مرضية. الضرر كان كبيرا جدا على كل الأنظمة العصبية الدفاعية. العلاجات التقليدية مثل العلاج السلوكي الإدراكي cognitive behavioral therapy أو العلاج client centered therapy الموجه تحديدا نحو الشخص لإعادة صقل وبناء طاقاته التجابهية ورفع منسوب ثقته بنفسه، أي السلف كونفيدنس أو تقديره لذاته أو السلف استيم، تحتاج لوقت كثير. إنها عملية معقدة وعملية طويلة الأمد وعملية تحتاج لمجموعة اختصاصات تتشارك بها. على الطبيب أن يصف أدوية للتخفيف من حدة المشاكل النفسية والعصبية التي نشأت تساعد الإنسان عبر رفع منسوب بعض الهرمونات في دماغه ليتقبل المتغيرات التي تظهر في حياته، أو حتى ليحسن أداءه ويتمكن من النظرة إلى الحياة بطريقة إيجابية بعد أن أصبحت كل الأبواب موصدة أمامه. وهناك العلاج النفسي التقليدي الذي تحدثت عنه الذي يواكب الأدوية. وهناك مشاركة العائلة بما يسمى بالفاميلي داينامكس، أي الاحتضان للبيئة الحاضنة المباشرة، أي العائلة أو البيئة الحاضنة المباشرة الاجتماعية. كل هذه الأمور حتى الآن أعطت مفاعيلا إيجابية، ولكن ليست مفاعيل بالمنسوب الذي نطلبه، لأن الضرر كان قويا جدا، ونحن بحاجة لسنوات عديدة لندرك ما إذا كان ما نقوم به قد أعطى فعلا منسوب من النتائج مقبول، أو أن هناك ضرورة لتغيير بالأساليب أو حتى تطويرها.
Now tell us, please, Doctor, finally, because we're about to do this with Rawad, our volunteer for this torture technique this evening. Tell us about the FACES pain scale.
معيار الألم يعكس في الواقع طريقة تفكير الإنسان أو الحالة التي يمر بها بهذه اللحظة. يمكن أن تدخل فيه بعض أمور التجابهية، أي يكون ببعض نظراته مقاوما بعض الشيء، رافضا للواقع الأليم الذي يعيش به، ناقما على سجانه وعلى معذبه. ولكن الألم هو العنوان الأول والأخير. إن منظومة الألم تتشابك في كل أجزاء جسمه، وهناك أعصاب تعبة في كل شيء، في الأذنين، في العينين، حتى في حاسة اللمس وفي حاسة الشم عنده، وهناك أوجاع متنقلة في كل الجسم. لابد من أن يكون نظرة الألم هي النظرة الغالبة، على الرغم من وجود نقمة في بعض الأعين، ثورة في بعض الأعين.
Well, we can see it in the drawing.
هي التي تحفز الإنسان.
We can see it in their eyes on the drawing, Dr. Nabil, but I can see it in the eyes of Rawad. Rawad, can you choose? Can you mark on the sheet, or are you just going to identify on the screen? Which of these faces represents how you're feeling right now? I've just told Rawad to take the earphones off.
بس بدي اقول اول ما بلشت اسمع الصوت، هلا ما عم بسمع منيح، ما عم بسمع منيح ابدا. يعني اول ما بلشت اسمع كان منيح، يعني انه ماشي الحال. بعدين صرت احس بوجع راس كثير، لدرجه انه بطلت بدي اسمع. صرت عم حس انه انا بطلت اسمع شيء. توترت كثير لدرجه انه جيت بدي شيلهم، بس قلت لا، بدنا نكفي الاكسبيرمنت للاخر. لو بقيت بعد شوي اكثر من هيك كنت وصلت للنمبر 7 او ما في اخر واحد تقريبا. الصوت كثير مزعج، كثير بيأذي. هلا عندي وجع راس كثير قوي، موتر ومشنج. ما بعرف، بعدني ما عم بسمع منيح، يعني حاس في شيء هيك بدينيه، وراسي كثير عم يوجعني. ما بعرف، يمكن قعدت شي 10 دقائق، ما بعرف قديش بالضبط، يمكن تقريبا شي 10 minutes.
more than 10 minutes.
فما يعني الاكسبيرمنت كثير صعبه، كثير صعبه. ما بنصح حدا يجربها. الصوت كتير مزعج، بعد الصوت اللي كنت عم بسمعه بعده موجود يعني. وكتير بيعطي يعني بالمنهم بتوتر الواحد.
Doctor, if you're still there on the line, is that a fairly typical reaction?
أكيد، علما أن هذه ردة الفعل تبقى مجتزأة من حيث الشكل، لأن الظرف الذي تعرض فيه صاحب العلاقة للتعذيب كان ظرفا تجريبيا، يعرف أن محيطه الحالي هو محيط صديق وليس محيط معادي. لو كان موجودا بين مجموعة أعداء تخضعه لهذا النوع من التعذيب لكان ألمه أكبر. نحن نتذكر أنه السيد جالوي يتذكر حتما وبعض المشاهدين الفيلم الشهير لستانلي كيوبريك كلوكورك أورنج، الذي ظهر فيه أسلوب معين للتعذيب بالموسيقى، تحديدا على سيمفونية بيتهوفن التاسعة آنذاك، والتي من خلالها أصبح الإنسان مجرد ملفوف، مجرد حبة من الخضار لا أكثر ولا أقل، لأنه تعرض لتعذيب متواصل. الموسيقى الصاخبة في الأذنين تخلق ما قاله صديقنا اليوم: وجع في الرأس، تعب في الأعصاب، إرهاق، وهن، ضعف التركيز، ضعف القدرات الإدراكية، وهذا كله اليوم ب10 دقائق بين محيط صديق، فكيف بالحال إذا كان في محيط عدائي.
Doctor, thank you very much for joining us. This has been, I think, a fairly epic edition of Kalima Horra. It came to us again thanks to the generosity and hospitality of the LIU, this time in Nabatea in South Lebanon. We have toured the world talking to those campaigning for the freedom of the men behind the wire, men who are being tortured systemically and daily for year after year. Indeed, many of them for more than 1 decade have suffered in this legal black hole that President Obama told us he would abolish, but has instead expanded. Dr. Hassan, the final word to you, and very briefly, please, the principal of the LIU here.
أنا بس حابب لكم لما صارت أحداث أيلول ب 2001 أنا كنت بأمريكا، كنت ببوسطن. في يقول إنه the $1 million question الأمريكان كانوا عم يسألوا لحالهم why do they hate us؟ بيكونوا سوبر أغبياء إذا ما عرفوا ليش العالم بيكرههم.
Well, I think that's just about the most important point of them all. Nobody seems to have realized that it is injustices like these, injustices like the one that used to be up on that hill, injustices like the one just down the road in occupied Palestine, injustices like the invasion and occupation of Iraq, injustices like the invasion and occupation of Afghanistan, injustices like the propping up of brutal dictatorships standing on the throats of their people year after year, decade after decade, injustices all around the world, double standards all around the world. It is that which has threatened the security of the United States, not any or all of the individuals behind the wire in Guantanamo Bay. And President Obama, if you build 10,000 Guantanamo Bays, if you put 100,000 people behind the wire, you will make your country less secure, not more secure. The only way that any country can be secure is to have just and equitable relations throughout the world, to behave in a moral and a just way throughout the world. That's the lesson that has not been learned in Washington, has not been learned in London. And as we know, as a result of the events of just the last couple of days, it's not been learned in the capitals of the European Union either. The people who are campaigning around the world are in part doing so because there are prisoners behind the wire from every part of the world. You can see here on the screen the kind of places from which these prisoners have come. They're all men, they're all Muslim men, and they all have families and communities and countries from which they have been taken, snatched, and held without justification, without charge, without trial, without limit of time. Guantanamo will not solve President Obama's problems, will not solve the problems of the United States. Let's go and see these figures. I've been George Galloway. This has been Kalima Horra on Mayadeen television in Nabatea, and I think it's been quite an extraordinary evening. Good night.